Kali and her dragon Zealer are on an adventure to find a cure for the sick Camden. After evading a group of dragon scavengers, they discover a volcano where Kali plans to immerse Camden in the lava for treatment. But the consequences of this action are unknown. Meanwhile, Camden experiences a painful sensation around Kali, hinting at a secret yet to be revealed. Join us to tame the wildest dragons. Let's get the subscriptions rolling. Chapter 20. Not necessarily. Harry got up from his chair and sat beside me on the bench. He plucks the diary from my hands, opening it to the first page to see whose diary it was. He grunted. This is Joseph Trishina's book. I have his son's Jeremy. He mentioned Prince Archibald's death in his diary. It shook Joseph. He was never the same after that. Yeah, he was too young to know the details of his death, only that he was in incredible pain. I'm assuming Joseph described the same symptoms as Camden. I nodded, mouth dry. The symptoms were exactly the same, even the thing crawling around inside him. Harry grunted again, peering up to Dad, then to our other brothers who had put their books down to crowd around us. Not used to having everyone's eyes on him, Harry ducked his head into his book and continued his synopsis. Jeremy hated seeing his dad so torn up over something the Ackers had declared wasn't his fault. It was just a genetic condition. Jeremy thought maybe if he figured out what it was that caused this illness in the Ackers, it would bring his father peace of mind. Did he ever find out what it was? Cotton asked. Harry pinched the bridge of his nose, a small sigh escaping his lip. None of the princes that generation got sick, so he couldn't study them. All he had to go on was the notes Joseph left behind. He was even allowed to read the Ackers' books to see what the family had on this illness. They wrote it off as a genetic deformity and left it at that. Harry shook his head in incredulity. You'd think a family with as much resources as they do, they would try to find a cure. Anyway, there didn't appear to be a pattern in the illness. Sometimes it skipped a few generations. Once it happened to 2 generations in a row, it was always the youngest son, and they were in pain, feverish, and something growing inside them. He didn't find much else on the illness, but he did discover how the Ackers got their magic. He sat up a little straighter, taking on a more professorly stature. A very long time ago, an Acker saved a dragon's life before we began taming them. That long ago, and in return, the dragon cut himself and bled into a cup. That Acker wasn't given any powers, but he did live to be 150 years old. In this time, he bore 3 generations. His heir's powers grew with every generation. His first family could only communicate with dragons telepathically. The second could control fire. The third bonded with 1 dragon each and shared their power. It was an interesting piece of history, but everyone knew the Ackers got their magical blood from a dragon. I didn't see what that had to do with Camden's current predicament. Harry turned to me, sensing my doubt. You said Marco attacked him when he saw Camden's dragon eyes, right? Maybe he can sense something we can't in Camden, and he's afraid of him. You mean he's like uber powerful? Giles guessed, scratching his head. Camden's sick because his blood is too potent for his body? It's possible. Yes, Harry agreed. Yeah. That's what Jeremy thought as well. He thought that maybe if his father had taken him to the birthplace of dragons, Archibald might have survived. After all, for the longest time, the only place for a dragon to be born was in the lava of a volcano. They needed the heat to weaken the eggshell so they could break free. Of course, since all the volcanoes erupted, dragon eggs don't need to be in lava to hatch as we witness every year. So I said, my mind turning over and over at the possibility of saving him. You think the dragon blood in him might calm down a sense if we take him to a volcano and drop him in some lava. I wasn't the only one who thought that was crazy, right? You said he stood in front of a fireball and didn't get hurt. The lava shouldn't hurt him. It was the shouldn't that worried me. But really, what other options do we have? We could sit here and let him die, or try to bathe him in lava and either watch him melt, or he could get better and be the first Acker to survive this illness. I stood up, decided, where do you think you're going? Dad demanded, noticing the determined look in my eye. He wore a wary gaze, wrinkles always more prominent when he looked at us this way. I'm going to take Camden to a volcano. The only volcanoes are in the Dragonlands. Just as well, I've been there before. I can fly there with Zeller and be back in a few days. My brothers, who did not know I'd been to the Dragonlands, snapped their heads to me in surprise. Since when Casper demanded sounding more like Dad than he realized. Well, I go at least once a year with Oliver. I waved it off. Now wasn't the time to discuss the places I traveled, which in all honesty wouldn't take that long. I had to save Camden.
The wild dragons won't let you into their territory, but they trust me. Zeller and I will be fine.
What about Prince Camden? Dad retorted, arms crossed. He wasn't having this, but too bad for him. I was his daughter, and when I wanted to do something, no one could stop me. When the dragons see him, they'll attack just like Marco. Marco attacked him when he saw his eyes. Camden will be passed out the entire time. You can't talk me out of this, Dad. I'm a Drisino, remember? And I swore an oath to protect my prince. That's exactly what I'm gonna do. I nodded to Casper, and thanks for reminding me of my job. Dad's eyes cut into his eldest son, and I swear if they were alone, he would have murdered him on the spot for talking me into the... Casper swallowed, then stepped beside me. Let her do this. Dad, Kyle can do it. Dad's face went red. Kyle is 20 years old. She's too young to be running into the heart of dragon territory. There are dragon scavengers between here and there, and many, many other creatures that would love to snack on little girls. Dad caught and said softly. He reached for his shoulder, then caught the venomous look and dropped his hand. She killed a swarm of goblins and a chimera last night by herself. She's not a little girl anymore. We raised her to be as tough as one of us, and you'd let us go to save our prince. Dad winced at that, dropping his gaze. I can't let her go. She's... Cowley, you have to stay here. That's an order. Matt would want her to go. Giles reprimanded him, flinching as he spoke. Mom had always been a sensitive topic, and right now when Dad was like, this was definitely not the time to bring her up. Callidus just like her. He went on, he'd opened his mouth, now might as well say what needed to be said. She'll go with or without your permission, I will. Just because Dad ordered me to stay didn't mean I was going to. Even if he locked me in my room, I'd climb out the window. He could lock me in the basement, and I would dig my way out. If he tied me up, I'd chew myself free. He trained me, I told him, taught me everything I know, showed me how to do things most people can't do. I was born for this. Giles is right. I'm gonna, whether you like it or not. Camden is my responsibility until he becomes a dragon prince. Would you really let me fail my mission because you're too scared to let me go? All my life, I never felt like I was my mother's daughter, that she was lost to us forever because of me, but that wasn't true at all. I was exactly like the woman my father had fallen in love with, and that was why he couldn't let me go. I was the only thing he had left of her. If I died, she would be lost to him forever. Tears brimmed his eyes. You're as fierce as your mother was. Collide and this tenacious. I know you can do it, but you better come back to us, child, or I swear to the 7 gods I won't rest until every wild dragon that could have hurt you is dead. I gulped, not about to tell him there were a lot more dangerous creatures in the Randala territory than wild dragons. It's because Illiser and I were small, we were safe to avoid the phoenixes, hobgoblins, griffins, and trolls that roamed the lands freely beneath the thick canopy of trees out of a dragon's sight. Zeller was not so small. I'll come back with Cam, I promise. Within the hour, I was armed to the teeth. Dad took me down to the basement and loaded me up with belts to hold a plethora of knives, armor, and a short sword. A whip coiled around my leg, looking almost decorative with its shimmery blue scales wrapped around the leather center. The barbs were as sharp as a fresh scale on a dragon's back, and just as strong. There were a few times I wished I knew this beauty existed while climbing and exploring the jungle. It would have come in handy many times. Also, it was pretty to look at. I could coil it around my body anywhere, and people would think it a funky accessory rather than a deadly weapon. Not that I needed to worry about surprising where I was going. Camden and I would be the only humans to have gone so deep in the Dragonlands, and it wasn't like he cared what I wore, especially in the state he was in right now. Feeling possibly overconfident with my many weapons and flexible armor, I pushed the healing hut door open. There were a few more healers around now that it was midday. They all stopped doing whatever it was they did in between patients and scowled at me. Amber marched through the curtain, Camden's steaming form only visible for a moment before the curtain concealed him again, and stood in front of me, arms crossed. He doesn't want to see you get out. After I let her walk over me the last time we spoke, I wasn't about to let her do it again, even though it thoroughly surprised me that he talked to her. However, it wasn't so surprising that he didn't want to see me again. I tried not to convey the sting. The words left on my heart. I don't care what he wants. I'm taking him. I let my hand fall onto the hilt of my sword in case she misunderstood me. She scoffed a laugh, golden eyes following the movement of my hand. You're not going anywhere near him. You're going to kill him. I found a cure for him, but I have to take him someplace. You're going to let me take him. Despite the fact I was ready to draw my weapon, she stepped closer to me, her face inches from mine. The faint smell of mint wafted off her breath. She spoke. There's no way you found a cure. You're good for nothing. Colin, go fuck a dragon and live in his den where you belong. I'll take care of the prince. He's mine. I don't care what he is to you. He needs help, and I'm going to do everything I can to do just that. You two can plan your little wedding when I bring him back. Sneering, she moved her hand to slap me. After years of training with brothers who loved sneak attacks, I was much faster and caught her hand. I twisted it around her back and shoved her face into the nearest pillow. She cried out, and I'd never felt so good. For once I could hit her pretty little face and not get in trouble for it. Camden's illness is good for something. I kicked the back of her knee. It buckled, and she went tumbling down onto the hardwood floor. I stepped around her for Camden's bed. He was covered in damp towels, steam rolling off him like nothing I'd ever seen before. His complexion was red when I removed the towels, as one would expect from someone so hot. His skin burned the exposed flesh of my neck when I draped him over my shoulder. Dear gods, he was heavier than the last time I had carried him. It didn't help that I hadn't slept since then, either. Still, I half-dragged him out of the healing hut, glaring at any healer who looked like she might want to intervene. After what I did to Amber, they felt less inclined to see what I would do to them for getting in my way. I met Zeller in the nearest field. He lowered himself nice and low to make it easier for me to haul Camden up into the saddle. The prince groaned, tossing his head back against my shoulder. Kalai, I'm here. I'm gonna make everything better. All right, just hang on for me, Cam. He moaned in response, squeezing his eye. I didn't know what that was supposed to mean. Probably, fuck, please let someone else make everything better, but I tried not to think about it too much when I readjusted his head and leaned him forward on the saddle. I slipped my feet into the stirrups and stretched around Cam to grab onto the handle. Let's go, Zeller, to the Dragonland. The large red dragon only needed to flap his wings once to get us airborne. We flew south, riding an air current through the valley. The further we went, the wind grew, but with Zeller's massive size, his wings caught it gracefully, not struggling in the least, as most of our tame dragons would with these winds. It was why I asked him to take me. He was big enough to ward off most predators and have no troubles in the wind. Plus, with Camden's growing weight, I would be hard-pressed to find a dragon who could hold both of us up for more than a few hours at a time. We made it to the valley's southern exit in good timing, veering west as soon as we passed the last mountain. The world opened up to a vibrant forest filled with deciduous trees. The smell of fresh mist and a hint of citrus reached me from up here, and I stole a deep breath. If I had never gone to Hystero and been introduced to the ocean, the smell of this forest would have been my favorite. Sometimes I flew over here with Elisur just to enjoy the pleasures of the forest below. However, as we continued our flight path, the trees thinned out, giving way to gravelly sand and siltstone. Instead of lush trees soaring high, the tallest tree was maybe 10 feet, barely noticeable at the height we flew, and the bushes were far in between. The vibrant colors of the forest turned into grays, greens, and terracotta. The land was barren of creatures, a stark contrast to the plains east of the valley. The heat rose up, scorching the back of my neck. Zeller slowed down so I could flip the collar of my jacket up to protect my neck. There's no point in taking layers off. Camden was so hot. Before we left the forest, the heat of this dry land was nothing in comparison, and by the time we reached the Dragonlands, I would have to put my layers back on again. When it would normally take 8 hours or 4 hours to pass over the dry land, Zeller did it in 2. The land began to roll in endless hills, forever growing higher, until the hills turned into mountains buried within the clouds. When we had first come here, I had mistaken the thick rolling clouds as ash looming over the sky. But then Elisir took me through one to show there was nothing to fear. The clouds only looked ominous. They rumbled with no flash of warning. They were seemingly permanent, always coiling around the mountain tops to protect the peaks from prying eyes. The mountains lined up single file, walling off anyone who had survived the desert from passing any further. Zeller increased our altitude to match the height of the jagged mountain. By this time, the sun was on its way down. On the same wavelength, Zeller landed on the side of one of the mountains, splitting the land in two, and found a large cave for him to nest in. Even though Zeller was the one who did most of the work, I was exhausted from holding Camden on the great dragon. I pulled him off Zeller's back, forgetting how heavy he was. He slipped off the saddle easily enough and flopped on top of me. I gasped for the air forced out of my lungs. Dear Lord, he was getting heavier every hour. What kind of genetic condition did this to people? He was so heavy, I couldn't push him off me. Zeller caught him between two claws and pried him off, laying him beside me. I stole a deep breath, inhaling the scent of ash and rock. It wasn't the most pleasant of smells, but it would get better once we crossed the mountain line. I grabbed Camden's wrists and dragged him deeper into the cave so Zeller could lie down properly. He blocked the entrance completely with his body, only allowing the last of the sunlight through the gap between his wings and the roof of the cave. I scavenged some wood and tossed a piece of dragon vein into the pile. The light filled the rest of the cave, revealing no other exits or creatures living within the space. Perfect. While Camden lay on his back, moaning and groaning, I went into the motions of unpacking my saddle for food and sleeping bag. Given the heat of his skin, I didn't think he needed it tonight. But if he wanted it, it was laying out beside him, open for him to slip into whenever he needed to. I laid mine adjacent, my head near his, and beside the fire. With a pot and some ingredients Cat packed for me, I made a simple stew. The sun was completely gone by the time the stew was done, and I was grateful to have something warm in my belly. Now the only light was my fire, but thankfully, between Camden and Zeller's body heat, I didn't have to worry too much about keeping warm. After I'd eaten, I shuffled over to Camden's side and tried to get him to eat. However, he only opened his mouth to convey his pain. Giving up on the stew, I soaked a cloth through and wiped the sweat away from his face, doing my best to let him keep some dignity. His eyes flew open as soon as my hand touched his cheek. They were gold and slitted, far too different from the mossy green eyes I had gotten used to. I jerked my hand away, but he caught it and growled at me, a low, deep sound in his chest, more animal than human. What the hell is happening to you? Cam swallowing, I gently pried my hand away from his face. Sorry if I hurt or scared you. It's only me, female. He grunted in such a primal way, I started, and Amber accused me of being a caveman. Some would argue that statement, I told him, doing my best to brush off how different this thing had made him. The worst thing I could do right now was freak out on him. Once I dipped him in some lava, he would be fine, back to his normal self. There's nothing normal about any of it. He stared at me, pupils widening the longer he regarded me. He wore no expression. Only the intensity of his gaze told me what he was feeling. But even then, I could be wrong. I hoped he looked hungry and I was his dinner. Cow, why are you looking at me like that? Has this sickness changed your appetite by chance? Like maybe meat human meat? It was my duty to care for him, but I was not going that far. He could starve if it was my flesh he wanted to eat. He cocked his head to the side. A motion I'd never seen him make before. He reminded me of a bird getting a better angle on its prey before it struck. You're scared of me. And then that predatory gaze was wiped off his face, replaced by one of agony. He curled up into a ball and shuddered violently. I went over to steady him while he shook, a hand on his shoulder, the other on his knee. It wasn't until I was leaning over him when I saw it. Two things rolled down the length of his back underneath his skin, exactly like how my ancestor Joseph described, and yeah, I felt like I might faint. It looked incredibly painful, and just the thought of something crawling under my skin, like that made me shudder. Oh, God. Cam, I hope my plan helps you. I don't know what to do if it doesn't. He cried out nearly a roar in response, clutching his arms to his chest and rocking. The sweat worked harder on his back than ever before.
He went.
Apple red all over. And then he passed out, Cam. I poked his shoulder. Nothing.
He was utterly slack under my hand.
Thankfully, his chest rose and fell. But it was at a fast pace. I was sure meant certain death for any ordinary person. I peered over to Zeller, hoping somehow he could do something for Camden, but the dragon was fast asleep. Poor guy had worked hard to bring us here before sundown. As much as I hated the thought of being alone, he deserved a good rest, and I wouldn't dare to disturb. With nothing else to do, I rolled into my sleeping bag and got whatever sleep I could. Chapter 2. I was yanked awake all too soon. Zeller had the end of my sleeping bag between his teeth as he pulled me towards him. I rolled out of the sleeping bag, catching the concern in his eye. My gaze instantly snapped to Camden, but he was sleeping as soundlessly as he could, all things considered. Zeller grunted softly, grabbing my attention, and swung his head purposefully outside of the cave. I stepped around his legs and peered outside. The sun had risen over the mountains, casting shadows over the desert plains. It lit up our side of the mountain quite clearly, giving me a full view of the group of men on horses riding up the mountainside. They were so close I could hear them from our perch. You sure you saw Dragon Key? We'd been looking all night and got nothing to show for it. It was impossible to tell which man it came from, as they were all muttering to themselves. It didn't really matter. They all looked the same, bulky, mean, and fugly. They bore weapons made of dragon bone and armor made of their scale. One man even had a very young dragon-linked skull attached to the top of his helmet. I know, but Keith snapped. I got the bacon. It came from Keith. Why would a dragon be flying from the east? The dragon they referred to must be Zeller. It left an unsettling knot in my stomach that we'd been followed by at least 40 dragon scavengers. Goblins, I could fight one big beast by myself, was stretching it a platoon of dragon scavengers. No one was that good, unless they had a bunch of dragons and dragon vein to back them up. I had one in a bag with only so much dragon vein. Fuck if I know. I know is that he'd make us a lot of money. I didn't like the cart they had in tow behind them. A ballista sat on top of it. Several steel arrows, longer than I was tall, laying beside it in the cart. A weapon that powerful with arrows that big. One shot was all they needed to take down Zeller and then Camden, and I would be thoroughly fucked. And we were in firing range, swearing under my breath because I didn't dare make a noise any louder. I whirled around for the cave and threw everything onto the saddle as fast as I could.
I Camden up last praying I wouldn't have to lift an unconscious prince into the saddle.
I hissed, shaking it.
I need you to wake up and do your best to get into the saddle and do it quietly. He moaned, and I had to cover his mouth. We did 2 beats, listening out for any signs. These scavengers heard him. Then when Zeller gave me the all clear, I pulled my hand away and rolled Camden onto his side. Please, wake up. I can't do this by myself. I should have let my brothers come and risk the dragon's wrath. Dragon scavengers were not people to mess with. His eyes flitted open. They were his normal green eyes, though they were more dazed than usual.
Kalai, he rasped. What's happening? Why are you so scared?
Dragon scavengers followed us, and if you can't help me get you into the saddle, we're going to die.
He let a tremor pass through him before rolling onto his hands and knees. Grabbing his arm, I helped him straighten up and guided him to the saddle. I climbed on first, then reached down to pull him up. With much effort on both of our behalves, he was on, leaning forward in the saddle. It was all I needed from him. Thank you. You can go back to sleep if you need to. What about the scavenger gods? Like he could do anything if he was going to struggle that much with that sentence.
Let me worry about them, was all I said, though. Camden passed out again.
I peered down the mountainside to see where the scavengers were.
They weren't in view anymore. I wasn't naive enough to believe they'd come halfway up this mountain to give up on the dragon now. No, they probably went around the corner to find a better path for the horses. Zeller, now's our chance. If we're fast enough, they won't have time to set up the ballista. Be prepared for evasive maneuvers on my command. The dragon nodded, then prepared to launch off the cliff face. The wind picked up, throwing my hair back since I didn't have time to tie it back. A second later, Zeller leapt off the ledge, spreading wings wide to catch the current. We shot upward, reaching the top of the mountain within seconds. Shouts were called out below, but we were so high up and moving too quickly for me to hear what they said. Zeller angled to the side, exiting the current, then flapped his wings to gain speed for the nearest volcano. We left the mountain line surrounding the Dragonland. We were hit with a wave of humidity and a cloud of mist. Zeller had to decrease our altitude for better air currents closer to the jungle's canopy. Some trees were so tall, Zeller had to veer away from them. Elisir had done it agilely, barely fluttering her wings to make the movement as long as I moved with her. But Zeller was nearly twice her size, and when he turned, he made much larger arches, nearly hitting other trees in the process. He could swing sideways, but with the weight Camden was right now, we'd both fall off. So poor Zeller had to risk clipping a wing. When we get home, I'll buy an entire bag of jerky just for you. I promise, the loyal drag. It still wouldn't convey how thankful I was for all of his efforts, but it was a start. He purred at the very thought. It wasn't long after we entered the jungle when large shadows loomed over us. I stole a peek upwards and saw 3 massive green and yellow dragons flying above. They roared and split up, one taking the rear, one staying above, while the other went below. The one behind us nipped at Zeller's tail. Enraged, Zeller roared back at them and whipped his tail across the jowls of the dragon who had attacked him. They did not take that kindly, the one above dropping low, claws out. Look out, Zeller. It was too late, and it didn't do what I expected, which was to claw Zeller's wing. Instead, his claws took hold of my waist and plucked me off his back. Camden slipped off Zeller's back and plunged down into the jungle. Catch him, Zeller. I cried, holding onto the claws as they loosened their grip on me to drop me into the endless jungle below. I could deal with the dragon. Camden wouldn't survive a fall like that. Zeller dove down, dodging a swipe from the dragon under him, and collected Camden in his claws before he fell too deep into the canopy. Relieved the prince was safe, I began my climb up the dragon's leg. It hissed at me, shaking its leg. I kicked its jaw when it tried to pry me off with its teeth. Oh, this dragon was in for a nasty surprise if he thought he could just pick me up and drop me. I was a dragon tamer. This was my thing. The dragon continued to attempt to throw me off, but I held strong, finding holes underneath its scales and in its joint. Once I was situated underneath its wing, I wrapped my legs around the joint and swung myself onto its back. The wind was much harsher down the middle of its spine. But as long as I had my feet positioned on its wings as joints, I wasn't going anywhere. It bucked and rolled to the side and upside down. I clung to it like I had with every dragon that had tried to shake me. Once it appeared, it stopped trying to do aerials to get rid of me. I unwrapped the whip still coiled around my leg and aimed for its snout.
I caught it the first time round and yanked it to the side.
The dragon had no choice but to obey where I steered it.
Now in control of my ride, I peered around to see where Zeller was.
The two dragons were attacking him from different angles, clawing and snapping. Zeller had gotten a few good scratches into their hides, but with two of them, they would steadily gain the advantage. I steered the dragon down for the one attacking Zeller from above. We collided into it, a thunderous clap ringing out in the sky. The dragon, stunned, didn't see the tree and smacked right into it. We went tumbling out of the sky, falling in a canopy. I held onto my dragon, ducking as close as I could to the wings, where it would instinctively protect itself from collisions. And then we hit the forest floor. I went flying off its back, rolling through the ferns until I hit a tree. The dragons cried out and thrashed in the tangle of vines they'd gotten stuck in. The vines were as thick as the thorns in Thorn's forest, too thick for a dragon without dragon vein to escape. Clutching my ribs, which appeared to hurt the most, though my head was a close second, I limped over to the wailing beast. The canopy was so thick there was hardly any light to touch the bottom. But where the dragons had fallen, it opened up, and the plants around the new sunlight seemed to react instantly, angling towards the light. It also made the vines that held the dragons thicker and tighten around the beasts. One was wound around a dragon's throat, constricting ever so tight. It whimpered, and when I came into its view, it tried to hiss, but only a cough escaped its lip. I held my hands up, showing it I didn't have any weapons, but my short sword was ready at my hip end. The whip was back around my leg, if I needed them.
I didn't come here to hurt you. I told it softly from where I stood.
It was actually a her. I can release you of these vines if you let me. The other dragon, who was not being strangled, snarled at me, doing everything he could to twist around and bite me. He was bigger than she was, more muscular, too. The angry roar escaping his jowls was a promise to kill me if I so much as touched the female. Share your mate. I can save her. Look at those vines around her neck. They're killing her. His eyes flashed to the vines, then to me. He understood what I was saying. Apparently, understanding didn't mean he trusted me. He growled, deciding he was too frantic to make any choices for his mate. I pulled out my short sword and cut at the vine encasing her foot so they could see I meant no harm. The male roared so loud the jungle quaked in fear. My ears rang for a few moments, but I kept going, slicing my way through the vines until I got to her throat. The female watched me closely, eyes darting wildly between me and her mate. I held her gaze. I needed her to trust me, because as soon as I cut her neck free, she could kill me in a flash. I'm not going to hurt you, I told her again, putting all the serenity I had in my tone. I could barely hear myself speak over my pounding heart. This was it. The day I find out if I pushed my trust in dragons too far, I reached forward, gripping the vine in one hand and placing my blade beside it. Very carefully, I began to saw away the tendril. It snapped free, flying in opposite direction. She swung her head high and shook the rest of the vines off her body. Movement knocked me back on my butt. I stared up at her, helpless to stop her if she chose to crush me with the weight of her foot or swallow me whole. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited, and then I felt her breath on my cheek. I gasped, knowing the pain came next. At least her last deed was saving a dragon's life. Yeah, that was a good way to go out, wasn't it? The heat of her moved away from me. Dragons groaned and growled. A vine snapped free. The forest wrestled. I braved a peak. The female had freed the male and now rose to their full height and stared at me, undoubtedly wondering what to do with me.
There was no more aggression in their eyes, so maybe after seeing I meant no harm, they would treat me in kind.
One could have always hoped anyway. Feeling probably braver than I should, I climbed to my feet and sheathed my sword.
My friend is sick. I informed them.
I read that a volcano might be able to save him.
That's why we're here.
I'm not here to hurt anyone, I promise. The male curled his lips back, revealing very large pointy teeth. However, the female hit him with her wing and seemingly glared at him. She bumped him again with her head, then took off through the hole in the canopy. Helpless to his love for her, he didn't give me a second thought and jumped to follow her, leaving me all alone in a dark forest infested with all kinds of creatures that would love to eat me. At least your track record for dragons is holding strong.
Yeah.
At least there's that chapter 22. After taking a moment to remind myself that I was, in fact, still alive, I stood in the center of the clearing the dragon pair had made and called out for Zella. To my disappointment, the forest absorbed most of my voice. Calling for him on the forest floor wasn't going to be enough. Sighing, I climbed up the nearest tree. Its trunk was thicker than a dragon's neck, but thankfully it was much easier to climb. There were so many sturdy branches to pull myself up on, and if I couldn't find one, there was a handy nook in the trunk for my feet and hands to use. I was covered in sweat from both my workout and from the heavy humidity. By the time I got high enough to see over most of the tree, settling on a branch, I cupped my mouth and called out to Zinga. His cry echoed my own somewhere nearby. I twisted around until I saw him flying in the opposite direction. I called out to him once again, and he turned his course for me. I waved madly on the off chance he could already see me. When he got closer, I yelled his name for good measure. He ducked into the clearing and waited for me to climb down the tree. Relieved to be near a familiar dragon, I wrapped my arms around his neck. Thank you for coming. I owe you 2 bits of jerky with such promises. He curled his tail around me and purred. And then I remembered why we were here. Where's Camden? Zealer opened up his claws to reveal the prince laying limp in his grasp. I went over to check his pulse. His hands flung out, grasping my shoulders and tossing me to the ground. He was on top of me in the next moment, fist aimed to punch my face in. His teeth were barred, eyes gold and wild, like I was staring into the eyes of a vicious beast, not the prince I had come to know and love. Cam, hey, Frozen dropped his fist, much preferring to hold his rib. With a moan, he dropped to his side beside me. Sorry, he breathed? I thought you were a dragon scavenger.
Yeah.
I don't think they would handle you quite as nicely, I muttered while sitting up straight.
Nice.
He cracked a laugh, the first joyous noise he'd made in over 24 hours. Is that what you'd call how you've been handling me? Every time I wake up, I find a new bruise. Those might have been from his fall off Zeller's back, but he didn't need to know that. Everything was under control for now. You're not dead. So yeah, I consider that nice. How are you feeling, aside from the new bruises? I scanned his laid-out form and couldn't find any serious injuries. His skin was still flushed, sweat soaking through his cotton shirt. He shifted his eyes from the canopy to me, green as the ocean. A light smile played on his lips, but his eyes couldn't hide the pain he was in. They didn't quite have that glimmer they usually had before all of this happened. I was just relieved to see the wild camp hadn't entirely taken him over. How close are we to finding this cure of yours? We'll be there sometime. Tomorrow, as long as nothing else interrupts us.
He brought his arm over his eyes and released a long breath. Then I'm fine.
I can manage one more day. Gods, I hate this, he muttered. I'm sorry. You must be in a lot of pain. I wished I could take it away for him, even if it meant taking it as my own. Sharing it had to be better than bearing it on his own. I longed for the days when he smiled and laughed and joked around with my brother. I wanted him to be able to take a step and not be in pain. More than anything, I wanted to hug him and feel how I felt in his arms when he carried me home from the healing hut. I'd never felt like I belonged anywhere, but something felt so right about being held by him. Not that he'd ever let you touch him like that. You seem to keep forgetting that he's going to leave and never come back once you found him a dragon and trained him up. He didn't even need much more training. All he needed was a dragon, and then he'd go home. Sighing to conceal the clench on my heart, I rolled to my feet. We need to get moving. I don't know how far away those dragon scavengers are.
Are you able to help me get you on the saddle? Or would you prefer to stay in Zeller's claw?
Saddle, he mumbled, then grunted as he staggered to his feet. I caught his arm before he teetered too far. We had a method to get him into the saddle now. So this time, it was easy to settle him onto the leather. He leaned forward with a grateful groan, and I leaned over him for the handle. The sweat of his back instantly dampened my shirt. But I was already sweaty from today's activities. I hardly noticed aside from the extreme heat. Let's go, Zella. We flew for a good couple of hours, the ring of volcanoes falling within our sight. It was getting too dark for us to fly to the nearest one, so Zeller landed by a large grouping of trees, digging his claws into the biggest trunk. It was a miracle. It didn't fall over from his weight.
It was easy enough for me to climb out of the saddle to find a branch to sleep on, but it was a bitch and a half to carefully drop Camden onto the nearest branch below the saddle.
With rope, I tied him to the trunk and the branch to keep him stable.
I tied myself to a branch above him, not trusting myself to stay on the branch without help.
Believe it or not, it was safer to sleep in the tree than it was on the forest floor.
Hey,
Camden mumbled, halfway between sleep and consciousness. He'd been drifting in and out of sleep all day, only just able to stay awake enough to keep his hold on the saddle. I peered over the side of my branch to see his shadow was already looking up at me.
Yeah.
Are you all right? I thought it was an odd question to ask, and it certainly wasn't the time to ask. Of course, I wasn't all right. We were being hunted even as we spoke, and there was still a very high chance Camden would die by scavengers, his illness, or me because I was stupid enough to believe throwing him in a pit of lava would solve all of our problems. The most I could ask for at the moment was that I'd been allowed to ride in silence for a couple of hours, uninterrupted by wild dragons or scavengers. Why wouldn't I be? I asked back. The last thing I needed was for him to worry or doubt me. His sole purpose should be to feel better. I barely saw his frown in the darkness. Something doesn't feel right when I look at you or smell you. Something inside me stir. It hurts.
Wow.
The very sight of me hurts him. Amber and Cadence had said some awful things to me over the years, and I had successfully brushed it off, not giving a fuck what they thought of me. But I cared how he thought of me. I'll do my best to hide my face from you then, so you don't have to hurt as much. I can't do a lot about the smell, though. Sorry. Feeling thoroughly disheartened for any chance of him forgiving me, I settled back on my branch and tried not to think about what he said too much while I slept. Good night, Prince. Wait, Kalei, I kept my eyes shut, refusing to move an inch for him tonight. There was only so much a girl could take in one day, and after being thrown around on a dragon and chased by scavengers, I didn't have the room to tolerate anything else. He sighed, agitated, knowing I didn't usually fall asleep that quickly. Fine. Good night, Kalei. The morning didn't come soon enough. My mind plagued me all night, hardly letting me catch a wink of sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said last night, on top of everything Amber had ever said to me. It was finally getting to me. Her words hadn't bothered me before, but now that I might possibly be in love with a man who didn't feel the same way, it hurt. I finally saw all the flaws she blatantly pointed out to me for years. It was so obvious why Camden would never feel feelings for me. I never thought I would experience pain like this, invisible and deep, yet just as real as any other injury a dragon had given me. It felt silly and hopeless to risk my life for someone who didn't love me, but
but I also couldn't bear a world where he didn't live. I had to save him regardless of the pain it caused me. Camden didn't wake up this time when I asked him to help me get him in the saddle. Of all the times, though, this was one of the better times for him to not wake up. Zaylor climbed down the tree and plucked Camden off the branch, cradling him between his claws. I hopped into the saddle, hoping Camden wouldn't wake up until we reached the volcano so he wouldn't see I'd gone against his wishes and made him fly in Zeller's claws instead of the saddle. Zeller had only beat his wings twice when a massive arrow came flying out of the forest and nearly clipped his wing. Zeller grunted in surprise, swinging his head around to see where it had come from. The canopy was too thick. It could have come from anywhere. Another arrow shot out, not too far from where we had been sleeping, left Zeller. I screamed, clutching onto the saddle. He banked, narrowly missing the second arrow. Get us out of here. With a snort of agreement, he made one powerful thrust of his wings after another, until we were out of range. The calls of the dragon scavengers faded quickly. I relaxed in the saddle, keeping my eyes on the forest below. How did they move so quickly in the forest? Sure, they had numbers, but there were several monsters that didn't care about numbers because they were so big or they had magic to aid them. It shouldn't be possible for them to catch up to us through all the terrain. Another arrow flew out of the canopy, but it went nowhere near us. We were safe for now. For how long, though, I feared it wouldn't be long enough. We should be able to make it to the volcano without them hassling us. But how long would we be there for? Harry never said how long it would take for Cam to get better once we put him in the lava. Was it instant? Would it take hours, days? We would be sitting ducks until he healed. And if they could follow us this quickly and easily...
It might be too late for us by the time Camden regained his strength.
Feeling more motivated to reach a volcano in decent time, Zeller kept his pace up, weaving between the taller trees, much easier now that it was only me in the saddle. The volcanoes grew larger and darker the closer we got. The dark clouds I'd mistaken as ash hovered over the volcanoes, rumbling more frequently, but still with no signs of lightning, threatening to strike us. Zeller picked a volcano that looked like the lava had exploded out of the side rather than the top. A massive hole stood out halfway the volcano, looking as if someone had thrown the biggest piece of dragon vein they could find to make a shortcut to the lava within. The entrance glowed a vibrant orange, enticing us to enter either that or it was a warning for us to go away. The heat increased, the air heavy. There was no wind for Zeller to ride on, so we landed at the base, placing Camden gently down a few feet away before landing. I slipped out of my jacket, already overwhelmed by the insane heat the volcano produced.
If it was like this at the base, what was it like inside?
Camden was too heavy at this point for me to carry him up the slope, especially with the loose ashen dirt slipping under every step I took. So Zeller helped me the best he could to drape Camden over his back. He moaned, a violent shudder running down his spine. I wiped his damp hair out of his face. It had dulled to the color of the dirt between my boots, as wet as my back. Everything's going to be all right, Cam. We're almost there. You can take a nice bath in some lava, and then you'll feel as if none of this happened, at least. I hope so. In my mind, there were two ways how this could go. The lava would kill him or completely cure him of his illness. Either way, Camden wouldn't be sick anymore. We began the climb. Zeller had a much easier time at it than I did, though I saw the strain on his back having Camden on. It would be too much if I rode on him while he hiked up the steep slope. My whole body was utterly drenched halfway up to the entrance. I stripped off all my weapons except my short sword and whip. I was tempted to take my armor off, but with the dragon scavengers not too far behind us, I didn't want to risk losing what little protection I had against them. Every so often, I peered over my shoulder to see if I could find them in the tree line. So far, they hadn't shown themselves, but it was only a matter of time if they moved as quickly as I thought they did. We'd only been hiking for 2 hours, and the flight here
hadn't been any longer. Zeller grunted, catching my attention. I followed his gaze upwards to the entrance. It was only a few feet away, the heat blasting out of it, scorching my skin. Every step closer, the burn worsened until my skin started blistering. We were just outside the entrance. A river of lava glowed and bubbled down the short incline. We're here. Sailor took a step into the cave, shouting, roared up from behind us. It was the dragon scavengers. They had left the tree line and were pointing at Zeller.
They cheered, kicking their horses to run up the slope.
The silt was too slippery for them, though, and the horses fell and rolled down the incline. More frustrated orders were barked. After whipping the horses didn't motivate them enough to stay upright, their leader ordered his men to hike the volcano on foot. Zeller, go take Camden to the lava. It's too hot for me in there. Anyway, I'll distract them. Once Camden is better, take him home. I couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. They broke my promise to Dad and to myself that we'd all come back alive.
Up until now, it seemed like a plausible outcome.
But the dragon scavengers were here, and I couldn't live with myself if they got their hands on Zeller or put Camden up for ransom. The dragon stared at me, commanded, thrusting a finger at the lava river. Leave me, Zeller. Don't ever come back for me. It's what they want. You can't let them catch you, or can you hear me? Look after him. Black smoke puffed out of his nostrils as he glared at me. I went on ignoring his ire. Destroy the entrance once you've passed through so they can't come after you.
Please do this for me, Sailor.
Damn it. Despite how hard I tried to fight, the tears came anyway. I was scared out of my mind, terrified for what was to come for Cam and Zeller, and for what would happen to me if the scavengers caught me. Thank you for everything, Zeller. Goodbye. He pressed his muzzle into my chest, expelling white smoke from his nostril. Reluctantly, he moved away, eyes sad as he regressed into the cave. I stepped back, giving the dragon enough space for him to swing his tail and bash the cave wall. The ceiling caved in, creating a wall of impenetrable rock. A wave of relief hit. They were safe. The dragon scavengers couldn't get to them, and Camden could take all the time he needed to get better. The relief was short-lived, however. The scavengers cried out in anger as they watched the entrance collapse. Their leader pointed at me. He wore an eye patch over his left eye, a deep scar running from his hairline through his patch and down to his jaw. His lips curled back into a vicious snarl at the sight of his prize vanishing behind all those boulders. Bring her to me. I ran the video is about to end, but the adventure has just begun. Don't go away. Subscribe to our channel, and next time we'll fly even higher.